Good morning and welcome. I'm Brian Dunning from Skeptoid.com. I'm a science journalist, and I have a weekly audio podcast on the internet called Skeptoid, Critical Analysis of Pop Phenomenon. Every week, we take a look at some question, something in popular culture that people believe is generally true, but that's not. And that can be a conspiracy theory, an urban legend, all sorts of alternative medicine stuff, something different every week, and it's always fascinating. That's my sales pitch. But this is one of the ones that was one of the most fascinating. Today we're going to take a really close look at one particular mystery. And we're going to go all the way back to the Cold War, back in the 1950s and 60s. There is a popular belief that the Soviets, during the space race, launched cosmonauts into space who died, who disappeared, never came back to Earth, and never made it into the history books. Were completely swept under the rug, and there's no record of them. There's a little bit of evidence for this, which we're going to look at, but it's a story that's kind of creepy, and it's really interesting to find out the truth of what happened. I love this particular little piece of artwork here. This is a Soviet space plane that was never built. I just kind of threw this on here on the title slide just because it really kind of took me back to these days of early design work, the early scientists doing this aerospace research. So the space race, beginning in 1957, up on the top left there, anybody know what that is? That's Sputnik. Sputnik was launched in 1957. That was when the Soviets officially won the first part of the space race. We responded in 1958 with Explorer 1, which is seen up there at the top right. That was our first craft in orbit. And who thinks they knew who the first person in orbit was? Was it Yuri Gagarin? It was this guy right here on the bottom left. It was Albert. Albert flew in 1948, way before anybody else. He flew on top of a captured German V-2 rocket that was launched from the United States. And then Yuri Gagarin down there, of course, he was the first human being to go up and to orbit the Earth. And so, again, the Soviets beat us in that part of the space race as well. While all of this was happening, there was these two brothers in Italy, just these young kids, about 20 years old, who got a hold of some radio equipment from their dad, and they started tuning in, trying to listen to these radio broadcasts. You see, when the Soviets launched Sputnik, they wanted everyone in the world to know. And so Sputnik was playing a radio signal, just a beep, beep, beep. And they published that frequency so that everyone in the world could hear and see for themselves that Sputnik was real and it was indeed actually up there. So these guys were Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordelia. This was not the only recording they made. They made a whole bunch of them. They had this facility. There's no great pictures of it, but this thing up here is actually a leftover from World War II. It was a bunker that they kind of moved into and took over. They filled it with all sorts of radio equipment. They had a vehicle that they could drive around with an antenna on top. That let them have two antennas far away so that they could triangulate the radio signals. And that picture at the bottom right, that was their best antenna. That was their biggest and best. They called their little radio observatory Torre Bert. They became very popular. Anytime launch was announced, reporters would come and show up and hang out at Torre Bert. Friends of theirs would come. They'd bring beer. They'd make a big party of it. Even it got so big that people from Italian intelligence would often show up because apparently these guys had a pretty good setup. And their actual archived library of real recordings from not only Soviet but also American space flights is truly a treasure, and it's one of the biggest and best and best preserved archives of all of these tapes. So here's Sputnik, and this is their actual recording of Sputnik. This was in October of 1957. Sputnik was, of course, unmanned. It was only about this big. But what's fascinating is that is actually the original recording made by the Giudica Cordelia brothers. And then in 1957, Sputnik 2 carried a small dog, a little Russian dog there, Soviet dog, named Laika. Unfortunately for Laika, this was a one-way trip. It was launched, but there was no provision made to come back down. And this is the recording they got from that. know what that is? It's Laika's heartbeat. The Judica Cordelia brothers' dad happened to be a cardiologist. So he's listening in and saying, that's a dog. And the Soviets announced that that's what it was, and so they confirmed it. Now, in November 1960 is when things started to get a little bit weird, because there was no known flight. There's no flight in any history books that happened in November of 1960. However, on one of the Soviet space frequencies that they had logged, they recorded this. They recorded this. How do I make it go? Sorry. Oh, it says no audio available. I'm fooling myself. They recorded an SOS sound, just do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. And they had learned that when a spaceship travels over, you know what it's called when an ambulance is coming? What is it? The Doppler effect. The Doppler effect. Sounds are higher in frequency as they're coming towards you, lower in frequency as they're going away. They learned to calculate the Doppler effect and to tell where these signals were coming from. This SOS did not have any Doppler effect. They concluded that it must therefore have been something that was headed straight away from the Earth. Now, there are various reasons why that can't have been the case. Namely, they didn't have a rocket booster strong enough yet to get anything away from the Earth, but that was their theory at the time. Here is a human heartbeat that they recorded in February 1961. There were also no known flights in February 1961. Their cardiologist father said that this sounded like a heartbeat in distress. And it was on a space frequency. This is not a military frequency, not a commercial aviation frequency. They concluded that there was a Soviet cosmonaut in distress in flight in February 1961. Here's a kind of a creepy one. This is, again, February 1961 when there was no known flight. They interpreted this to be the breathing of a dying man, and listen to him. That tape is just about 50 years old now. So here's the most dramatic of all of their recordings, and this is the one that we're going to focus on today, because when I did the podcast episode about this particular subject, I simply went through each of these one by one and I explained why they could not have been actual space launches, because of the technology, because of this, because of that, but I wasn't able to answer the question of, okay, so what were they? So the purpose of today's talk is to focus on this one particular recording, and we're going to see exactly, okay, what was it? You're going to listen to a woman who has been called Ludmila by history, and this is the recording that the brothers made of her. It's in Russian, obviously, and this is the translation. She sounds like she's in a lot of distress. She sounds like she's frightened. And look at the things she's saying. It's dangerous. Talk to me, as if you're not answering me. I'm hot, I can see flames. I'm going to re-enter, I'm going to crash. Fairly dramatic stuff. And the recording goes on for several minutes. Now, we do know that the Soviets had an interesting history of changing their records. So look at this picture. Here's a group of nice, friendly cosmonauts. Look at the tall gentleman in the middle. And now look. Same picture. He's been airbrushed out. See that? Whenever anyone went out of favor, and by going out of favor, it could be as little as going to a bar and getting drunk and falling on your face in the street. That dishonors the program. They throw you out of the program. They erase your records. They did this on many occasions. Here's another such picture. Notice that officer sitting in the back seat right there on the right. He's gone. Now you see him, now you don't. There's a number of pictures like this, We do know for a fact that the Soviets did change history whenever something happened that they didn't like, they didn't feel reflected well upon them. So how can we tell that these were not actually Soviet space flights? The number one reason is that there's no corroborating reports from much better equipped radio observatories in other countries. 1959, 1960s, these are the days of the Defense Early Warning System, the first worldwide network designed to detect incoming missiles and incoming bombers. NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, was established in 1958. This is big time stuff. This was huge radio antennas all over the world, radar systems all over the world. The Americans, the Canadians, the Germans, the British, the French, they all had these systems, including giant systems like this. It's a tracking dish. It can look at the spaceship going by and it can track it and follow it. Remember that thing that the Tory Burke brothers had? Just looked like a TV aerial. Didn't track. So they had very poor equipment compared to what some of their rivals had. If there had been any Soviet failures, the West, this being the Cold War, which was a war of propaganda, the West would have loved nothing better than to promote those. The reason it didn't happen is probably because there were no such failures. Can't say so for sure. It's almost impossible to prove a negative, to prove that something didn't happen, but we can point to evidence that almost certainly would exist if it had happened. There's another reason that Lyudmila probably was not a Soviet cosmonaut. And that's because that in 1961, when her recording was made, there were no such thing as female cosmonauts. Her recording was in May of 1961. That's the date to remember. The female cosmonaut program was not approved until 6 months later, in October of 1961. The first 5 women seen here were not even selected until the following year. And it was a year after that that the first woman actually flew. If we believe that Lyudmila was a woman cosmonaut flying, we would have to believe that the Soviets took a step back for 2 years. And that's simply not the nature of the space race. Nobody ever went backwards. They were so desperately trying to outdo each other, the United States and the Soviet Union. We never took backward steps. We went from putting dummies in the space capsules to putting dogs to putting people, and then eventually to putting women in them. We never went backwards. So the timeline just simply doesn't match up. We know that they had, when Yuri Gagarin flew, he flew on Vostok 1. That was in April of 1961. Lyudmila was in May of 1961, the following month. Vostok 2 was flown by German Titov in August of 1961. So we're expected to believe that Gagarin, it was in April, Lyudmila was in May, and German Titov was in August. Now, Yuri flew on Vostok 1, Titov flew on Vostok 2. Well, there was no Vostok 1.5, so Lyudmila couldn't have been in there. When German Titov flew, they were so poorly equipped, they actually had to cannibalize his spacesuit they cannibalized Gagarin's spacesuit to make German Titov's. They had very shortages of resources. There simply was no way that you could have squeezed in another flight. They certainly didn't have the hardware. They certainly didn't have a booster ready for her. They didn't even have a spacesuit ready for the next guy that flew. So it just doesn't make sense anyhow that they could have had someone in space, let alone a woman, who hadn't even been trained yet. So then we have to answer, well, who the heck was she and what was she doing? Because that recording is a legitimate, real recording. Well, the name Lyudmila, where does that come from? We don't know. It just sort of arose out of popular legend. There were 2 women named Lyudmila, but they both died in 1961 in the program, and they were wives and girlfriends and people who worked in the program. They had not yet been trained as cosmonauts. So we have to ask, what was she doing if she wasn't flying in a spaceship? Does anyone happen to recognize this bad boy right here? If you're into aerospace, you'll love this. It's usually not seen in the titanium white like that. That's the American X-15 spaceplane. The X-15 spaceplane was flying during these times. We'd drop it from the B-52 bomber. It's actually a B-60 because it was modified. its rocket engine would launch, it would take off, it would leave the atmosphere, it would re-enter and come back and land. So we got to figure that if we had something like this, isn't it possible that the Soviets could have had something like this too? It didn't have to be a rocket launch. Maybe Lyudmila was flying some Soviet version of an X-15. It's entirely possible all the things she could have been reporting about feeling hot, re-entering, and all these things. The X-15 was able to go Mach 6.7, 4,500 miles an hour, and it could get up to 353,000 feet. That's 108 kilometers. We usually consider 100 kilometers to be the beginning of space. Astronaut wings were actually earned by 2 American pilots, Scott Crossfield you may have heard of, and another one you may have heard of, Neil Armstrong, also earned astronaut wings in an X-15 before he went to the moon. Here's the typical mission profile for an X-15, and look and see what it does, and see if we can maybe match this up to what we heard from Lyudmila. She takes off, she blasts up to a high altitude, 50 miles, she's flying around in near vacuum, and then she has this big drop, re-entry heating. You see that? This is an American published profile for the X-15, re-entry heating. That sounds a lot like what Lyudmila might have been going through. So we've now got a working theory. Maybe Lyudmila was flying something like a Soviet version of the X-15. So let's see what kind of things they had similar to an X-15. Well, here's one. This was called the VKA-23 space plane. It was never built. The program was canceled in 1960, a year before the Lyudmila recording was made. You have to understand one thing about the way the Soviet design bureaus worked. It was really one of the most messed up systems that ever existed in the whole history of mankind. You had competing design bureaus. Each one would have some genius designer would be at the head. They were a very political system. This was the Soviet Union after all. If someone fell out of favor, he could insult someone's wife. He could, one of his projects could go bad. They would fire him, and whenever they did that, they canceled his entire design bureau, including all of the projects they were working on, no matter at what stage they were at. And these design bureaus never shared information between them. They were considered to be competing with one another. So multiple times, you had projects like this that were practically ready to go that simply got canceled for no reason other than political disfavor. It was unbelievable to read about this stuff. Here's another just such a project. They called this an orbital glider, although it's got maneuvering engines on the back. This was also never built, and it was also canceled in 1960. So again, 2 systems that were capable of competing with the X-15, or may have been capable, canceled right before the Lyudmila program happened. Here's one that actually made it to a testing stage. It's called the Cosmoplane and rocket plane. Here's what it might have looked like. This is just a model, a manned version right here. But they actually did test a version that had, there was just a capsule that didn't actually have a manned person in it. And that test didn't happen until 1962, a year after the Lyudmila recording. This was the first time they got anything like a space plane together. It was unmanned, and it was a year after Lyudmila. So we're kind of running out of options. What the heck could the Lyudmila recording have been? Well, let's take a look at some other technologies. Does anybody recognize this? Without reading the Russian, does it look like an American plane you may have seen or heard of? The U-2 spy plane. This was the Soviet copy of our U-2 spy plane. We had one that was shot down over the Soviet Union. Francis Gary Powers, they captured him, they put him in jail, and they basically reverse engineered his U-2, and they built this copy of it. There's an amazing story about this particular plane, because this plane was completely ready to go, ready for its test flight, except the engine hadn't been installed. The design bureau got canceled. The plane was scheduled to be scrapped up. The engineers who worked on it were so proud of it and didn't want it to be scrapped, they literally stole the airplane. They took the wings off, they trucked it the middle of the night to a barn, literally a barn on a farm, and hid it in there, trying to protect it from being broken up. They failed. It was found and broken up. But it's just another example of how amazingly badly the Soviets did things. So they never had their Beriev S-13, C-13? S-13? I have S-13 written down. And this happened again in 1962, a year after the Ludmila recording. So when Ludmila recording was made, there was not even a U-2 available, some sort of a high altitude plane. Well, what if she was just flying a fighter plane? Could she have just been a woman fighter pilot? They had women pilots. They had plenty of women fighter pilots. That was not unusual. Right here are this is the fastest and the best on the bottom. This is a MiG-21. In 1961, the MiG-21 was operational. It could fly Mach 2.2 and go to 62,000 feet. Now that's pretty fast and it's pretty high, but it's not fast or high enough that you'd have re-entry heating, flames, any of the dramatic things that Ludmila was talking about in her recording. So right above it, we see the prototype super duper hyped up version. That plane up there on top, the YE-150, was designed and built specifically to go after our U-2. It could fly as high and it could shoot it down. It could fly faster and higher. Again, it couldn't fly high enough or fast enough to approach anything like re-entry or flames or heating or anything like that. Unless it caught on fire, who knows? So I guess we can say, yeah, Ludmila might have been flying one of those, but it just doesn't really match up very well to what she was saying in her recording. So I had kind of a clever idea. I'm a big fan of urban legends and things like that. So I had studied the whole Roswell Area 51 thing, right, with the aliens. One of the most interesting things that actually did happen at Roswell Army Airfield was this. Joseph Kittinger, in 1960, he rode a hot air balloon up to 102,000 feet and did the world's fastest high dive. He still has the record for it. He flew at 614 miles per hour as he was falling, Mach 1. He's wearing a helmet. He was in radio communication. He free fell for 4 minutes, which is about the length of the Ludmila recording. Is it possible Ludmila was doing some sort of a high dive like this? Part of Kittinger's glove malfunctioned. It wasn't quite sealed all the way, and he got frostbite on his hand, and it was very painful as he was falling. Maybe that could account for some of the, she was saying she was hot. Frostbite can feel like a burn. Seeing flames, maybe. It's just a clever idea. It's a possibility. It's not a very good match, but it's one other thing that might possibly be a match. So let's come to the conclusion. We've pretty much eliminated everything that reasonably might explain what Ludmila was doing. So I decided to go back to square one and see what was broken with this whole hypothesis. What I learned was that you have to get your own translators. I got a hold of these 4 Russian-speaking friends, and I gave them the original Ludmila tape without any context. I didn't tell them who she was, what it was about, what the popular internet translation was. And here's what they came up with. Here's the things, the most notable things that she was saying. First of all, almost everything she says is just a lot of numbers. She's just counting off numbers, 22, 23, 24, 10, 10, 10, 15, 10, 12. She's just saying tons of numbers. Only very rarely does she say anything that's not reading off a number. Well, did she say anything like, isn't this dangerous? Nope, nobody heard her say anything like that. How about, talk to me, you're not answering. They said, well, that's one interpretation of what she's saying, but we think she's just saying, I'm ready to transmit, I will transmit now. And she goes on saying numbers. How about, I'm hot, I'm hot? My translators listened to that and they thought she said, don't give up. Don't give up, as if being encouraging. You're doing good, don't give up. Or that's not right. There's another possible translation. It was really murky, hard to understand a lot of this. How about, I can see a flame? Sounds very dangerous. Nobody ever heard her say anything like that. Am I going to crash? Nobody ever heard her say anything like that. And when she says, I'm going to re-enter, it sounds so heartbreaking. She says, help, I'm going to re-enter, I'm going to be killed. They said, that's not what it means. It just means time to come back now. Return, return, re-enter, return. So really, the Ludmila recording doesn't exist at all. It's a fiction. It was a really bad translation that someone made at some point and tried to attach an interesting story around it. What we think happened, and this is completely unsupported, it's just a guess, is that she was working with someone in sort of a training capsule. She was the person on the other end of the radio, talking him through his procedures, giving him feedback on his instruments, telling him, reading off numbers to him, telling him it's time to transmit now, it's time to come back now. Maybe he was flying in a plane, maybe he was flying in a simulator. As far as the tone of her voice, was she really scared? That was something that the translators were split on. Some of them said, no, she doesn't sound scared, she sounds encouraging, or she just sounds excited. It's kind of a subtlety, and a lot of these Russian terms had more than one interpretation. But I think we have clearly established that there's no way that it could have been a missing cosmonaut. Now, this is only the one of all of these recordings that we looked into in any great detail, but it was really fun, fascinating, and quite an adventure to do. Learned a whole lot of stuff, and I think we conclusively proved that the Ludmila recording simply does not exist as it's presented to be. Here are some very cool resources if you're interested in any of this stuff. Astronautics.com contains all sorts of information about the early days of training the Soviets, including a lot of documentation that was made possible after the wall came down and the Soviet Union opened up. There's whole transcripts, descriptions, day-to-day accounts of the Soviet cosmonauts in their day-to-day training activities. We know who had breakfast with who. We know who liked who was friends with who, where their bedrooms were at the training facility. So much detail, you can find this all at astronautics.com, that it's absolutely impossible that unknown people could have been inserted into the story and taken out. There's so much detail of how they lived their daily lives that we would know about it if it's not true, if it was true. LostCosmonauts.com is the best archive of the Judica Cordelia brothers' actual recordings. There's a lot of fascinating stuff in there. I mean, I played 4 or 5 of them for you today. There's dozens that are on there. It also goes into great detail about the technology that they had, their history, setting it up and everything. The one criticism I would have of it is that it's completely credulous. It completely promotes the idea that without exception, all of their recordings do represent lost cosmonauts without offering any possible alternative explanations. And there's a great book called Soviet X-Planes that I got to find out all about these other cool jets and projects that never quite came to fruition. So a lot of neat, fun resources if you're into that sort of a thing. So that's the end of this presentation. If anybody has any questions. Have we had any questions on Twitter yet?
Yeah, we have one. Someone asked, any chance of putting your podcast into a TV show?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Someone offer me a TV deal, and we'll gladly convert it. No, I actually get asked that all the time, and we've made a couple of abortive attempts at. We've put together 2 pitches. We made 1 TV pilot, but TV deals just simply don't grow on trees. They're very, very, very hard to come by, and especially my show sells the opposite of what networks want to buy. They want to hear the sensationalized version of stuff. I'm trying to say what's more interesting is the non-sensationalized version. So it's an uphill battle. Anyway, what's the question over here?
About the dog, Laika.
Laika.
You said that when it got shipped out to space, it never got brought back.
Yeah.
So they let it die out there?
I have heard, yes. Yeah.
It's still out there now, rotted?
I've heard 2 different things, and someone on Twitter, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard that Laika eventually did re-enter. The dog would have already been long dead by then. It would have taken years. Or that she is still out there, probably still orbiting. I mean, it was an orbital craft. It wouldn't have left orbit and gone out. There was not enough energy in the boosters for that to happen. So Laika did die, mummified. and then either re-entered or is still out there. I'm not sure which, but it's pretty gory. The history of the boosters, these Vostok R7 boosters that they had, is a really clear way to tell when someone could have left orbit. The SOS signal, remember those that the brothers interpreted as going directly away from the Earth, that's simply impossible because at the time the boosters couldn't lift more than 500 kilograms into orbit. They couldn't have lifted hardly anything out of orbit. They had at one point launched the Luna probe, which was a very tiny little thing that just flew past the moon. So that did leave Earth's orbit, but it took an entire booster to do it and a very tiny lightweight payload that never could have accommodated the weight of a human being plus the life support systems and everything. You're going to need a lot more than 500 kilograms for all of that. But following the history of the boosters gives you a good clue to what might have actually been a plausible explanation for some of these.
Are you familiar with the game Call of Duty Black Ops?
Called what?
Call of Duty Black Ops.
No. Oh, I played Call of Duty, not the Black Ops though.
Well, in the beginning, it's this lady, she's at a microphone, she's reading off numbers, and I was wondering, like, did that have to do with the other lady that we were talking about?
Just sounding like the numbers stations kind of thing, just reading off coded numbers. Does she read them in blocks of 5?
Yeah, I think so. She was like 22, 35, 26. And
one way that it'll tip you off that what you're hearing is a code is if the numbers are given in blocks of 5. And that's just a convention in encryption. Even a simple code like I'm wearing a black jacket. If you wrote that out, took out the spaces and just made it I am wearing a black jacket, just spelled out all those letters, you would separate them into groups of 5. That's just kind of a convention in encryption. So if she's reading numbers in blocks of 5, if you listened to these number stations we played in the last hour, she would say 10, 5, 17, 20, 5 numbers. Then she'd repeat those 5 numbers, then she'd go on to the next one. So that would be the way to tell.
it was like that.
Then I'm sure that was inspired by it. The number stations are fairly popular on the internet, so I'm sure some gamer programmer would have thought that'd be a cool element to throw into the game.
Someone tweeted back about the Sputnik 2.
Sputnik 2?
Yeah, they said that Sputnik 2 re-entered Earth's atmosphere on April 14th, 1958, after 162 days in orbit.
Ah.
That's what it says.
There's our answer. Laika lasted for 162 days and then burned up.
Yeah.
A moment of silence for Laika. Poor
Any
thing.
other questions here?
The Ludmilov tape, it definitely came from the space channel that those two fellows in
Yes.
Italy were looking for?
Yes.
So if they were just doing simulations and things, it still would have shown up on that channel?
Well, we don't know. All we know is that it was a radio station that had been used for their space flights before and for space communication. It seems perfectly reasonable that they might have also used it for training. That's a detail that we just don't have. But it certainly wasn't a commercial frequency or anything like that.
As for like all of the planes that you showed us, like they were all basically used to do the same thing, right?
The space planes?
Yeah.
To try and fly up.
Like a lot of the wings were like shaped differently. Like one of them was like really long, and then the other one was like bent.
Great question. Yeah, it's different solutions to the same problem. Are you familiar with the SR-71 Blackbird? The SR-71 Blackbird, it looks like a giant black dart. There's a lot of these outside aerospace museums around the US. It's got these 2 long engines, big flat black dart, really short little rounded wings. Obviously a high-speed plane. It is, in fact, it holds all the speed records for aircraft still, even though it's been out of service for decades. And then you compare that to that U-2 looking thing, that Soviet version of the U-2, that has these great big long skinny wings. Both of these aircraft were designed for spying purposes, to get as high as possible and to take pictures down. They attacked this through 2 different solutions to the same problem. The fast planes, the space plane looking ones, with their little short stubby wings, their main weapon was speed. They would go so fast that an air-to-ground missile couldn't catch them. They could get over Soviet airspace or American airspace and be gone, take their pictures and be gone before any missile could catch them. Speed was their answer to it. For the U-2, their answer was altitude. It's obviously a much, much slower plane, but its wings were so huge that it could fly super high in very thin air. So it didn't need to go very fast because it was higher than any interceptor planes could reach it. Unfortunately, in Francis Gary's Powers case, it wasn't high enough for an air-to-ground missile to be safe from that. So yeah, that's a great question. Anyone else on the Twitters got anything for us?
Yeah, someone did confirm that it is a number station on Call of Duty.
Do they say which number station it is?
No, they didn't.
I'm gonna have to check that out. Just going back. Oh, there we go. Whoops, there it was. Yeah, there we go. High flying plane, slow speed, and high flying plane, high speed. Two different answers to the problem.
Other plane.
That? That?
You get that one after 3 kills, and then like rare when you get like after 7. Oh yeah, 8.
It's an interesting history to the U-2. Pretend this is a U-2. This is a copy of the U-2, but before we had the U-2, we needed a plane to do this. And so we took a British bomber called the Canberra, which instead of having the engines right here, it had the engines on the wing here and here. And its wings were much shorter. They only went to about here. And that was the Canberra bomber. We took it. The only basic modification we made is we chopped the wings off after the engine and then added on something huge like this. And we flew those on the exact same mission as U-2s for some time before the U-2s finally went into service and just brought those engines inboard. But it's kind of funny if you ever see a Canberra spy plane. It looks almost identical, it's just got engines out there on the wing. It's an interesting to watch the evolution of espionage, how quickly they needed solutions to these problems because the space race, so much was happening so fast. And this whole thing was all about propaganda. You know, if we can get a dog into space first, that's good propaganda. If we can get a woman into space first, that's great propaganda too.
So in terms of publicity, did they publicize when they were trying to do it, or did they wait till it was a success before it was publicized? So
yeah,
there's no evidence that it would have been, you know, like we're putting this up and then
yeah, they typically would typically announce their successes, and occasionally they had to announce their failures because there would be something that was spectacular, a big huge explosion that they couldn't deny that everyone would have seen. In which case they'd usually say that it was something fairly mundane, it was just a test of a booster. They would never admit if it had people on it or something like that. Yeah, they definitely didn't say, we're going to launch something next week because it might not work.
With Sputnik, what you said, it was how big exactly?
Like a basketball is usually what's
Like, was
described.
that ever anything like problematic? Would it being that small and going into space?
How so?
Like, I just asked, like, in general, is there anything like that could have went wrong from being so little?
Well, the benefit in being so little is it's much easier to get it up there. You know, weight. Space launches are all about weight. You know, I forget what the numbers are, but like if you look at the Saturn V that took people to the moon, it's this gigantic tube of fuel. And most of it is that gigantic first stage. And all that does is it gets the rest of it up this high. And most of what's left gets the rest of it up this high. Only a tiny, tiny percentage of it gets the crew up to the moon. You have the same problem with Sputnik. If Sputnik was twice the size, you would have needed a much bigger rocket, not just twice the size, but also bigger because it would need to carry all that extra fuel. And to carry all that extra fuel, you need a bigger rocket, which weighs more, so you need more fuel. It builds on itself very exponentially, so the small size was critical to being able to get it up there. It made it a much simpler problem. All it needed to do was go around and beep. So it wasn't that hard of a problem. Doing on time. We've got 9 minutes. I can dance. I can invent other questions. Yes, sir. Black Ops.
So, with the Sputnik thing, they only used it for a camera to go around the globe to have it as an orbit.
Sputnik didn't even have a camera. Sputnik did nothing but beep.
So.
To have a camera, you would have needed to be able to recover the film. You'd need to bring it back down, and that would have required it to be much more complicated and more failure prone. All they needed to do was just prove to the world that we can launch something. So that was why all it had to do was beep, and they just published the frequency so everyone could tune in, and they could prove that we've got something up there beeping. That was all it did. It didn't provide anything functional. No research, nothing like that. Just in your face, USA, we beat you to it, which is a pretty strong message.
Okay, we have one on Twitter. How many human fatalities, U.S. or Soviet, before Gagarin's, is that how you say his name? Success.
Before Gagarin's success.
Mm-hmm. How many fatalities?
I only know of one. If anyone can correct me on that, please do. And it was really quite a dramatic story. What is his name? I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he was one of Gagarin's best friends inside the cosmonaut training program. And this happened just a few days before Gagarin's own launch, so it was really traumatic for him personally and could have affected the program. They were doing a test inside a simulated environment, and he had, he's inside the capsule, pure oxygen environment, and he had an alcohol swab. I don't remember what he was trying to do with the alcohol swab. He was wiping his helmet or wiping something with it, and he's done with it, and he tossed it. And it landed on an electric heater in a pure oxygen environment. And kaboom, the whole room turned to just fire. No air, just fire. He was completely burned from head to toe. They pulled him out of there still alive. He'd lost all of his skin. He was horribly, horribly burned. I believe he lasted for about 2 or 3 days before he died. And Gagarin was right there with him through most of the whole episode. It was a very, very horrible event. And you think how this must have affected Gagarin saying, gee, I'm supposed to fly in one of these things in a couple of days. And he went ahead and did it anyway. There was a lot of real heroism in those guys. I mean, they were the enemy and everything, but their story was at least as dramatic as our own. You know, we lost 3 astronauts in the same way. Gus Grissom, John White, and Ed Chaffee. In a very similar incident, we had a sparked wire inside an oxygen-filled capsule, and it burned up. And Grissom was cranking the door. You had to crank this thing like 200 times, I forget the number, to open the door, and he made it like 190 turns before he died. It was just awful. So the deaths in the early days of the space program were pretty grim deaths. As far as I know, that's the only guy who actually died before Gagarin. I don't believe anybody died in launches or attempted launches. Sir.
I always wanted to know, what's easier, getting out of space or coming back?
Is it easier to get out of space or to get out into space or to come back? Coming back, you just go and you'll make it back. They're very, very different problems. It's comparing apples to oranges. Getting into space just requires huge amounts of energy. Does anyone know the Spaceship One program, Virgin Galactic? You know, the space tourism, you pay $200,000 and you get to go up in one of these little things. They're building the space center in New Mexico right now. That spaceship is called Spaceship Two. It has seats for 6 passengers. And all it does is it goes straight up and it comes straight back down. Get a few minutes of weightlessness up there at the top. There's no way that craft could ever get into orbit, because by the time it gets that high, its speed is 0. And its speed would need to be about 25,000 miles an hour if it was going to get into orbit. That's many orders of magnitude more energy required for that. It's a completely different problem. Getting into space is just tremendously hard. That's why the Saturn V was so huge, and that's why the space shuttle has these gigantic solid rocket boosters that do most of the work and don't even get it up very high. Getting into space is very, very hard. Getting out of space is also really hard. Depending on where you're coming from, if you're trying to land on Mars, you know, it's a whole navigation problem. You've got to be exactly right on target, and you've got to come into the atmosphere at exactly the right angle. If you come into the atmosphere at too shallow of an angle, you bounce off, and you're off into deep space, and you have no way of getting back. If you come in at too steep of an angle, you hit too hard and you burn up. So those numbers are very, very fine. They have to be extremely precise. Both of those problems have happened multiple times. If you can hit just the right angle, then it becomes pretty much a problem of just slowing down properly without burning up, without spinning out, like what happened to the Columbia. The Columbia, everything was going fine, but a hole burned in the wing, and that caused it to suddenly spin out of control. That's one more problem that can happen. It's just many different sets of problems. Yeah?
Let me bring in the...
I always wondered what happens to the parts when they break off when the rockets are going out.
The parts that break off, like the spent stages?
Yeah, like how it goes a huge rocket and the part breaks off and it gets smaller and then it breaks off again and then it's the smallest part and it has a rocket on it.
Yeah, what happens to the successive stages as they get spent and they're expended? Some of the biggest ones will fall back down. Some of the higher ones will fall back down and burn up. Some of the other ones will stay in orbit. There's all sorts of orbital stages floating around out there. I did one great podcast called The Astronauts and the Aliens. I did that last year sometime. And it was about these reports of Apollo astronauts, guys who were on their way to the moon or who were practicing Apollo flights, seeing alien spacecraft and reporting it to the ground stations, and now all of these conspiracy theories growing up around that. And in almost every case, it turns out that what they were seeing was simply a spent stage. Sometimes it was their own stage, and sometimes it was a stage from some previous Russian flight. But that's really interesting. If you go to skeptoid.com and just search for the astronauts and the aliens, that's a really cool story. So yeah, different stages, they end up, the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle, you know, those would just fall right back down and parachute and land in the ocean and be reused. The big orange tank that goes up with it is so big that it goes up so high, it burns up. There's no parts of that left. Yes, sir.
You were talking about like if you come at like not at the right angle, you can like bounce off and get lost in a deep space. Has there ever been a spaceship that actually like really got lost and couldn't find its way back?
Yeah, no manned ones, but probes sent to other planets, particularly to Mars. If you look at our record of sending stuff to Mars, it's horrible, and that includes not just the U.S. but the Soviets as well. The Soviets have the world's worst record of trying to get to Mars. Japanese have tried it. I don't know what the percentage is, but it's something like 10% of Mars missions have been unsuccessful, and for all sorts of reasons. You remember that highly publicized one where there was a problem between English units and metric units. Some part or something had been designed, said, yeah, make it 25 long. Said, okay, 25 inches. No, 25 centimeters or something like that. That was literally a problem. And in that case, it hit too steep, and it just slammed into the atmosphere and just burned up. No hope of slowing down fast enough. As far as ones that have skipped off, missed Mars and kept going, that's happened too. I can't tell you, I don't have enough knowledge with the Mars missions, but I know that that has happened. And once that happens, of course, they only had fuel to get there and land. They certainly didn't have fuel to turn around, come back. To carry that much fuel, the rocket would have had to be 4 times larger to take off. Just the way these numbers add up and just get exponential.
Got a couple on Twitter, if you can.
Okay, we get just about out of time, but let's take a couple of quick Twitter questions.
Okay. Someone asked, would you pay to go to space if given the chance?
Yes, I almost did.
And then somebody asked, I'm not sure, do you have any opinion about the current controversy over Alexei Kosygин's death? I don't know who that.
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay.
How do you spell it?
The last name is Kosygin.
I regret I am unfamiliar with that situation.
Those were our last two.
So whoever sent that on Twitter, email that to me. I'd like to find out about that.
All right.
Okay, well, I guess we're done. Thank you very much.